afternoon, everyone, and thanks for attending this fringe meeting, which is on war and impairment and the social consequences of disablement. We've got a number of guest speakers here, and I'll ask McLuskey, the General Secretary of Unite, to go first. Len.
Okay, thanks, Sean, and good afternoon. It is afternoon. As normally happens at conferences, of course, there's all kinds of fringes that clash with one another, and unfortunately I'm due to be speaking at another fringe exactly now. In fact, I think one of the problems that occurs in fringe meetings is competing, because I know for a fact that the fringe I'm going to go to, there's a number of people who will be at that fringe meeting that would have loved to have been here as well. When my office eventually, when the dust settles and they check where I'm supposed to be, I made it clear that I wanted to come here in order to identify with workers with disabilities so that I could indicate Unite's commitments. Now I know that fortunately Diana, who's been fighting all her life for equality issues, including disability, will be speaking in more detail on behalf of Unite. But I just wanted, in essential, to welcome everybody to what is a crucial issue for all of us. Any group of workers within society that is being discriminated against means that we are all being discriminated against. And I wanted to congratulate the organisation and the work that Richard's doing to bring this to the attention, because bluntly that's what we have to do. The issue and linking it with the centenary of the beginning of the First World War, it is clever. I'm delighted that Lindsey's here. I mean, she'll be continually busy. I was just saying to her, the ruling elite seem to love the idea of wars. It gives them something to talk about at dinner parties, and so they're constantly wanting to get involved in wars, irrespective, of course, of the consequences. The First World War, some of the figures were staggering: 16 million people dead, 20 million people injured with disabilities. It was interestingly Lloyd George who came up with the phrase "a land fit for heroes," and of course that's what was promised after the First World War, only to be reneged on by the Conservative coalition governments that followed. And really, it was not until the Second World War where a Labour government after that actually delivered on some of the issues that were relevant to disabled people. It was after that, of course, that Remploy was created, something that's close to both Sean and my own heart. I had the privilege for 16 years of being the chair of the Remploy consortium of trade unions, and it was a privilege because I met disabled workers who inspired me. And I don't know whether this is politically correct enough for me to say so, but the truth of the matter is I'm always inspired and bowled over by the commitment of disabled workers, by the tenacity. And I put it down to the fact that every single day of their lives when they wake up, they face a problem and they deal with that problem day in, day out, so that when they have to deal with issues within the workplace, then it comes natural to them to effectively resist against employers and to fight against governments. And of course that's what I found within Remploy. Fantastic people, great trade unionists, and we were engaged not only in industrial fights but in political fights as well, because the issues relating to Remploy date back to about the early 90s, when a certain guy by the name of Michael Portillo decided to use Europe. He was anti-European at the time, and he decided to use Europe as a reason why we couldn't give government contracts to Remploy factories, Remploy workers who produce the highest quality of work that you could imagine. Portillo said, no, we can't put it out to tender. The European rules tell us so. Not absolutely disinterested in what would happen to disabled workers, only interested in using them in his fight against Europe at the time. Quite disgracefully, the future Labour government followed the same line. I remember having an argument in the late 90s with Ed Balls, no less, over what Labour planned to do, the cutting back in Remploy. I remember having a personal discussion with him and saying, why are you doing this? Well, it saves us money. Do you know how much money it was going to save them, what the Labour government were going to do? £21 million. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And yet, they felt it was an easy target. Of course, they found themselves up against a very resilient workforce fighting quite rightly for their rights. But that thin wedge that the Tories drove in, and unfortunately New Labour continued, has now been completed by this government. And what's happened to Remploy workers is disgraceful. And Sean will tell you the vast majority of our members who have left Remploy as the factories have closed down have never gained work elsewhere. There's always this argument within the Disability Forum about supported workers and disabled workers in mainstream employment. And we used to say at the time, and who should get a bigger cut of the cake? And we used to say to these organisations, this is a false argument. Of course, it's not us against you. Of course, there's a place for supported and integrated disabled workers, and we shouldn't be fighting one another. The argument is that the cake's not big enough. And that's precisely what we've been campaigning for. And like many, many other issues of late, we're being vindicated by what's happening in this austerity-driven world. We're constantly being vindicated that what we said was true, and what we've been saying about disabled workers, what you're campaigning for, is going to strike a chord if we continue the fight, which I know that you will all be doing. So Sean, I just wanted to come personally to commit myself to your campaign. We'll be looking forward in Unite to celebrating the Disability Month in November to December and continuing to give as much support as we can. It's my personal view that within the trade union movement we don't do enough for disabled workers. And we need to step that up, and even demands on me as General Secretary of Unite. You need to, I was going to say shout a bit louder, but I shouldn't say that to Sean because he's always shouting at me. But it's the right thing to do, to demand more, because this is an issue that affects us all. So please forgive me for not staying. As I say, Di will go into much more detail. And I wish you every success. Okay? Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Len. Okay, before we go to the next speaker, I just want to say a couple of words. I should have opened up on this. As you know, historically, soldiers, sailors, service personnel injured and disabled through conflict could look forward to quite a bleak future. Those unable to find work, for the most part, threw themselves upon the mercy of charitable organisations. Though we also know there were amongst their number those who became the early disability campaigners and argued for rights, not charity. And the rights but not charity battle has been going on for around a century. While there have been great strides in disability rights, the rights not charity argument still persists today, especially today as we watch this government brick by brick demolishing the edifice of disability rights. And with that, I'll hand you over now to Lindsey. Just a quick thing. Lindsey German is the national convener for the Stop the War Coalition. Thanks, Lindsey.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sean, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I'd like to congratulate Unite and Richard on the work that they've done, in particular the brochure that I think everybody has on their seats. I think is incredibly well-informed and well-written piece of work about the history of some of these questions, and particularly their relationship to war. Now, I want to talk about war as the effect that it has on human beings, obviously the ones who lose their lives. What we're talking about today is the people who don't lose their lives but who suffer in all sorts of ways because of the effect of the war. Now, Len referred to the First World War as the 100 years anniversary. I suppose it was both the First World War, but it was also the first mass industrial war where millions of people around the world died, and even more people died as a consequence of war, through influenza, through hunger, through all sorts of other social issues. So you're talking about an immense catastrophe on a scale that had never been seen before. In this country, which was by no means the worst hit, if you look at the number of casualties, there was something like 800,000 people died in the course of the 4 years, the vast majority of them soldiers and other military. But there were also 1.6 million people who received some kind of pension for physical injury and disability. Now that obviously doesn't take into account, firstly, the people who weren't allowed to qualify for those pensions, but also the people who maybe were mentally ill as a result. If you read many of the novels of the period of the 1920s and the 1930s, they have characters who they talk about as suffering from shell shock. In other words, the mental consequences of the terrible things that they've seen and done, and all these sorts of things that happened to them. 41,000 people in this country lost at least one limb, and again, if you read in here, you will read the kind of way that they graded how much you would receive. It wasn't based on, you know, what you needed to live or what your family needed to live, because, as we know, very rarely are pensions and benefits adequate for that kind of thing, but you would get slightly more if you lost slightly more of a limb. I mean, it's a grotesque way to actually look at what people need. 60,000 people were shot in the head or in the eye, and one of the things that you can read about, which even now I think is very difficult to read about, is that some people had such physical impairment that they made masks to cover their faces, because people couldn't face seeing them, and they probably couldn't face being seen. Now, this is all forgotten when you see David Cameron and all these people talking about the First World War and all this kind of thing. We should remember the dead and all these other things. It's absolutely true. Very little is talked about the people who suffered but who survived. And of course, when they came back, far from having a land fit for heroes, they came back to unemployment, they came back to poverty, they came back to a society which sent them to war but wasn't prepared to deal with the consequences of that war. And therefore, there were many mutinies and protests at the end of the First World War. Some of them were in Luton, in fact. They burnt the town hall down. I don't know if anyone's from Luton or whether that's something that's happened kind of since. But at the heart of that protest was the people from the veterans, the injured and disabled veterans. And as has also been said, the way in which they were treated after the First World War, they had to set up many institutions in order to deal with the injuries that people had. But they were treated very, very much as charities. Very many ex-soldiers actually were beggars on the streets and all that kind of thing. They weren't treated with the kind of dignity which they should have been. And it was only after the Second World War that you even got a hint of that with the development of a welfare state. But even then, as I'm sure other speakers will talk about, that actually it was only with people with disabilities themselves being the people who began to organise and began to campaign and began to say this is a political issue, that any advances at all have been made in this kind of area. Now, just to bring it up to the modern day, I mean, Len said we all seem to be having wars, and certainly this summer I think we've seen perhaps the most dangerous situation in the world since the Second World War, with the conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, and of course in Iraq that are going on now. Now, after the War on Terror began, which is 13 years ago, the United States government deployed 2.5 million troops to fight in these various wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. One of the features of modern war is that most people who die in wars aren't soldiers and military anymore. I mean, they do die, and thousands of British and American servicemen have died, and some women. But the vast majority of people who die in these wars are civilians. When you look at these people who are now at Calais, trying to get into this country, the people who want to migrate into this country, the vast majority of those people are refugees from wars in Libya, in Syria and in Afghanistan. If you look at the casualties of, for example, the Iraq War, where nobody knows how many died, but one estimate put it at over 1 million, certainly it's in the hundreds of thousands, and 4 million people at one point were refugees. You look at the casualties of that, you look at the use of depleted uranium, which the Americans used in Fallujah 10 years ago, and the effect that that has on births and the impairment of pregnancies, the loss of life, children born with mental and physical disabilities. This is an absolute commonplace now. If you look at war, it's also worth saying that, of course, while if the majority of people are civilians, there are also civilians of very poor countries by and large which don't have even the health service and the facilities that we have. And one of the things that has happened in recent years is that the World Health Organization has had its funding cut systematically, so less and less money goes to these sorts of people. There are two areas I really want to highlight when we're talking about this question. The one is the international question and what it means when people say we can't afford aid for all these countries. What they're saying is they're consigning those people, many of whom are victims of war, to not be able to have a decent life, to not be able to be treated, to not be able to have a decent income or any of the things that they need. But of course it also has an effect on the people who've served in the armies and the air forces. I spoke at a conference last week during the NATO summit in South Wales with somebody who came from the United States, and he said that with post-traumatic stress disorder, which has only recently been acknowledged as an injury of war, actually what they're finding is some of the worst forms of this are coming from people who, they call it pilot drones. They don't pilot drones, of course. They sit in a computer in the Nevada desert and they kill people in Pakistan, Afghanistan and somewhere else. They say that some of the worst stress from doing this job is not because they are in immediate danger, because they clearly aren't, but because what happens is they suddenly realise, I've killed some children, I've hit a wedding party, I've done all those sorts of things. And the horror of that, even when it's thousands of miles away from the actual injury that you've committed, is very, very great. So this is a huge issue as well. And of course, it perhaps shouldn't have to go without, it should be remarked on all the time. But if you look at ex-service in the United States and Britain, very high levels of homelessness, of alcoholism, of drug abuse, of domestic violence, many, many social problems caused at least in part by what has happened to them as a result of war. So my final point is really, well, I suppose two very, very quick final points. One is we're talking about these issues at a time when we are also facing some of the worst austerity that any of us have seen in our lifetimes. On Friday, they actually, the Lib Dems in the government actually moved to bring an end to the bedroom tax, but how many people have suffered as a result of that tax being introduced? How many people have had their families destroyed, their lives destroyed? And many of those people are people who are people with disabilities, who needed extra rooms for carers and all the other things that they needed. So that is a very big issue, and it seems to me that part of campaigning as trade unions, as anti-war movements, as all these things, is also campaigning against this austerity. And when people say the money isn't there, the NATO summit last week committed that every single country will pay more for so-called defence, that now that everyone has to pay more than 2% of its budget. This means that David Cameron will go back and say we want more money to be spent on defence when we're not spending it on benefits, we're not spending it on schools, we're not spending it on any of those sorts of things. So it seems to me that that is a very big issue for us. And finally, just to end, is to say this, that none of this would be on the political agenda without organisation, without people in the various campaigns, without people in the trade unions doing all the things that they've done to make this a central and a political issue. So I think I think it's, I think that is the final lesson we have to take from this, that we do not change things without the people concerned and the people who support them standing up and campaigning and organising. And if we organise, we can win. Thank you.
Thank you. Move on now to Troy. Troy Davies is the United Shop Steward, and he's also. Sorry, Troy.
It's all right.
Okay. Troy himself has been a member of the armed forces and gathered injuries and a disability through his serving his country. He's a Unite shop steward and a trade union activist. Troy.
Oh yeah, I just want to say my name's Troy Davies. I joined the army at a ripe old age of 16 in 1979. After finishing the training, I was posted to Aldershot, lovely town, full of soldiers. While there, I was trained as a signal driver more than anything else. But as with all British soldiers, we diversify and we learn other trades. I went on to train as a combat medic. Somehow, one day during training, I had an accident, pretty severe. I spent a few months in hospital, being treated and rehabilitation. After 2 or 3 months, I was then told, okay, you're fine, go back to your regiment and go back to your old job. Which, at the age of 19, you think, okay, fine, they know all best. So I went back and doing it. Now, when the Falklands kicked off, my regiment was one of the first ones that was mobilised to go out there. When we came back, as a medic, I noticed the guys that were coming back with injuries, some pretty severe, loss of limbs, head injuries. It was phenomenal. It was the surprise not only of them, but it was also the people that were around me who had served there. We noticed there was a complete difference in how we behaved and how we reacted, and it was quite shocking, to say the least. I saw these guys coming back, being treated by doctors, and then finally being discharged from the army. And it was just saying, bye-bye, no longer care for you. Over the years, my injuries got worse. I could no longer run, I could no longer carry the weight we used to carry when I was running, so it come that I too would be medically discharged. I left the army with a grand payment of £3,500 and told, okay, there you go. There's 3 things in life that you can guarantee on, and that is 1, death, 2, taxes, and also 3rd, a skint squaddy. Money comes in one hand and it goes out the other. Didn't last long, so things that I got a job. When I left, I was told that within 4 years I'd hear from the Department of Works and Pensions and that I would be probably entitled to a war pension. 4 years came and it went. Never heard a thing. So by this time I'd met somebody and I thought, okay, fine, I'll try and get some more money and see what happens to go towards a house. So I applied for pension and I was turned down. I then applied again, and through tribunal I was granted pension of 20% disability, which worked out £100 a month, £24 a week. This went on for years. One of the excuses that they gave me for turning me down the first time was due to the fact I hadn't gone to the doctors very often, that obviously I wasn't hurt enough to get the pension. Not that I was still getting prescriptions for painkillers, anti-inflammatories over the years. That was not taken into account, not one little bit. Come 2006, 2007, I got that bad. By this time I'd had both hips replaced due to arthritis. I'd also got rheumatoid arthritis in my spine and 80% of my other joints. I thought, well, considering I'm getting a bit worse, I'll go back and try and be assessed. I filled all the forms, then set them all off, being a good boy. I thought that was it. A month later, paperwork came back, denied. It hasn't got any worse. So I applied again for the tribunal. That was turned down. So you sit and wait And I thought, no, I'm not going to sit around. I'm sat here, I'm in pain most of the time, I'm going to apply again. So I applied, and this time I had the Royal British Legion with me as representative. They read all the documentation about my injuries, about my service, and that was taken with me when I went to the tribunal. When I got to the tribunal, there was 3 doctors, me and my representative from the British Legion, and a guy from